Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. A'udhu billahi min shaitan rajim. Bismillahir rahmanir rahim. Apologies, I had a PowerPoint. I don't know, for some reason it's not here. So inshallah, I'll do my best to still present it in a way that's not going to put everyone to sleep. So I'm going to talk about something that's perhaps a little bit different from some of the other topics that we've discussed so far. Mashallah, we've had a lot of very interesting things about like quantum mechanics and all this kind of stuff. I'm going to take more of a historical approach towards the study of Kalam, particularly taking a look at a debate that emerged in the 16th century Ottoman Empire, and then from this debate about the legitimacy of Kalam, try to now understand some broader trends about the history of the Islamic intellectual tradition. So one thing that we see very often in modern approaches to the study of Islamic intellectualism and the Islamic intellectual tradition is that it is very often presented through dichotomies. It is presented through, periods of golden ages of Islamic intellectualism and then dark ages of Islamic intellectualism. It is presented through rationalism versus literalism. It is presented through esotericism versus exotericism. And these are very easy dichotomies and very easy narratives for professors of history and students of history to digest, right? Because you can pigeonhole certain characters in Islamic history into certain preconceived notions about who they are, right? So it's very common, for example, to talk about the history of Sufism, the early history of Sufism, and say that there was this tension between Hallaj and Junayd, right? And the Junaydis won out over the Hallajis. Or you can talk about in fiqh, Ahl al-Ra'i versus Ahl al-Hadith, right? And say that these are two different approaches on different ends of the spectrum, and different groups went out in different places. Or you can talk about the philosophers slash Mu'tazilis versus the Hanbali Atharis, right, in the 9th century. In the era of the Ottoman Empire and in modern Ottoman studies, this is presented through dichotomies of, were the Ottomans original in their thought, or were they simply following earlier peoples? Did they actually provide something new, or were they just regurgitating the same intellectual trends and movements that had existed throughout Islamic history? Again, these are very easy narratives, especially when it comes to the Ottoman Empire. Something that you find very often is that there was this supposed golden age of Ottoman intellectualism that was very open and very accepting of new ideas and things like that. And people will cite Sultan Mehmed II in the mid-15th century bringing Italian Renaissance painters to come and paint his portrait. And then they contrast this with Murad IV in the 17th century closing down coffee houses. And they say, well, there you go. See, we have this one person who's very interested in new ideas and he's very open-minded, and then a closed-minded era of dark ages. One of the theories and the theses that is put out there is Halil Inaljik's famous triumph of fanaticism. For those who are familiar with Ottoman intellectual history, he posits the idea that the late 16th, early 17th century saw this rise of conservatism and this rise of textual literalism in the Ottoman state that fundamentally changed the way that Ottoman scholars interacted with their own intellectual tradition, and that this, in the end, ends up leading to the eventual decline of the Ottoman Empire. Again, this is a very easy narrative because it fits with the political narrative as well, right? You take a look at Ottoman political history and it is growing for the first 200, 300 years, and then it stagnates and then it declines. So they try to make this connection between intellectual history and political history. This particular thesis of Halil Inaljik has been refuted by many different scholars, particularly Khalid Rawayhib in the past few years has really kind of attacked this idea of this supposed triumph of fanaticism. Now, there are a few things that the Ottomans do that are very unique before we talk about the issue of Kalam specifically. When it comes to the institutionalization of aspects of the Islamic intellectual tradition, there are some really unique things that the Ottomans do, particularly the institutionalization of the office of the Mufti, whereas even today in many other parts of the Muslim world, a mufti is not an official government position. But in the Ottoman state, they were one of the first that said that no, I mean the qadi is already appointed by the sultan. Now we're also going to have a mufti appointed by the sultan. They also institutionalized the madrasas. Instead of the madrasas being separate from the government, now the Ottoman government itself says if you want to work in the government, you have to graduate from this madrasa, and once you graduate from there, you can go to the next one and to the next one. And the madrasa hierarchy was actually very directly connected and related to the mufti hierarchy. Right? If you taught at a certain madrasa, you can switch from that position over to being a certain level of qadi or a certain level of mufti. So now you have a semi-official, I would say, Ottoman bureaucracy of ulama known as the ilmiyya in the Ottoman state. Now what's important about them, in contrast to other ulama in other parts of the Muslim world and other times of Islamic history, is that the ilmiyya of the Ottoman state represents the semi-official positions of the state itself. And very often you have, for example, Shaykh al-Islam Abu Saud Effendi, who was the Grand Mufti of the Ottoman Empire in the mid-16th century, really does kind of serve as a symbol of the Ottoman state as well as the Ottoman intellectual system. Another scholar who is going to be the focus of my talk in the mid-16th century is Tashqur Ahmed. He is a graduate of the madrasa systems, and at different points in his life, he is a qadi and a teacher in the Ottoman madrasa hierarchy. By the way, since we don't have a PowerPoint, I'll just tell you guys, he dies in the year 1561, just so that we can kind of place him. He has two prominent works that he is most well known for. The first one is Miftah al-Sa'ada, which is an encyclopedic work in which he basically talks about any and all Islamic sciences that have ever existed in Islamic history. He defines them, he talks about what the major books are in each one and the importance of each subject, or some other subjects perhaps not so much. His second most prominent work is Shaqa'iq al-Nu'maniyya fi Ulama al-Dawla al-Uthmaniyya, which is a biographical dictionary of the first 10 generations of Ottoman scholars. He actually, unlike a lot of other tabaqat works, what he does is he organizes it according to sultan as opposed to according to generation. So he has 10 different chapters, one for each of the first 10 sultans. He lived during the reign of the 10th sultan, Sultan Suleiman, which is kind of used as, or described as a golden age of the Ottoman Empire. So now in his Miftah al-Sa'ada, he has a chapter on Kalam, in which he begins with a definition of the science of Kalam itself. Now, we're not going to get into the definition of Kalam itself. MashaAllah, we already got a little bit of that from Abdurrahman earlier today. But his definition is a science by which one is able to confirm the articles of religious belief through rational proofs. He talks about a few of the different types of approaches to what Kalam is, but this is the one that he starts out with, and it seems like the rest of his chapter goes along with this definition. Afterwards, he describes who the great scholars of Sunni Kalam are. Notably, he mentions Imam al-Ash'ari and Imam Maturidi. And then interestingly, after this, he talks about the fact that there are people in his time that argue that Kalam as a science is absolutely illegitimate and should not be taught and should not be studied. And he complains about the influence that these people have on Ottoman society, and that these people are causing problems, and now people look at the ulama of Kalam as these fusaq, and that we shouldn't listen to them, and that things were much better in the past when this wasn't the case. Now, just kind of a side note, I wouldn't put too much emphasis on his claim that things were better in the past, because this is kind of a trope that we see amongst a lot of historians and scholars in Islamic history, that they always say, oh, well, things were so much better 100 years ago or 50 years ago when I was studying, and things like that. So you see that very often. But these people who are claiming that Kalam is illegitimate, Tashqur mentions that they cite the four fuqaha of fiqh as proving their points. And they have quotes from Imam Abu Hanifa, Imam Malik, Imam Shafi'i, and Imam Ahmad saying that Kalam is absolutely haram, and anyone who engages in it is this, and that. So for example, and Tashqur cites these quotations. One of them is that Abu Hanifa forbade his own son from engaging in Kalam. He says, and his son says, well, you engaged in Kalam back in the day. And Abu Hanifa says, yeah, but I mean, it was different for us because we weren't trying to destroy our opponents. We were just trying to explain the aqidah, whereas in your time, everybody's just destroying their opponents. So kalam is, Abu Hanifa basically forbids his son from doing so. Imam Abu Yusuf, of course, the most famous and important of Imam Abu Hanifa's students. There's a story that's related about him, saying that people who engage in kalam, the mutakallimun, have absolutely no business leading the ummah whatsoever, and they should be ignored. There's a quote of Imam Malik saying that the testimony of the people of bid'ah and hawa is not to be taken. And then his companions, Imam Malik's companions, supposedly said that by Ahl al-bid'ah wal hawa, he meant the mutakallimun. Imam Shafi'i says that if people knew what is in the science of kalam, then they would run away from it the way that people run away from a lion. Imam Ahmad says that those who engage in kalam will never be successful, and there is a disease in their heart. So these are like really intense quotes from not just anybody. These are the four fuqaha of fiqh. If you're going to ask anybody what's halal and what's haram, it's these guys. So now Tashko Pirzadeh, as a graduate of the Ottoman of the Ottoman madrasa system, obviously is not going to go along with these types of approaches towards kalam. So he sets out a defense of the science of kalam. And he starts this defense by saying that there are three things that make kalam impermissible. The first of these is when your methodology in kalam gets mixed up with the methodology of the philosophers. All right, so he says, for example, if you're going to take un-Islamic philosophical ideas and impose these methodologies on your own aqidah, notably obviously taking reason as superior to revelation, right? That makes your engagement in kalam impermissible. The second of his three rules is that your conclusions, assuming that your methodology is correct, your conclusions have to be in line with the Quran and Sunnah. So even if revelation is the number one source in your kalam epistemology, but your conclusions contradict the nas of the Quran and Sunnah, then that is impermissible. And he says the notable groups here are people like the Mu'tazila, the Murji'ah, and the Rawafid. And then the third rule is that you cannot let kalam overtake you to such an extent that you are amazed by your own abilities and you kind of have this huge ego, and your only interest in kalam is destroying your opponents and having a lot of money and fame and things like that. So now, after laying out these three rules, Tashko Pirzadeh takes a look at the established kalam tradition of the Ash'aris and the Maturidis, and he says that points number 1 and 2 don't apply to them anyways, right? Because the whole point of the Ash'ari and Maturidi projects was to purge kalam, or to purge philosophical ideas and bid'ah ideas from the science of kalam anyways. So obviously the most notable example would be Imam al-Ghazali writing Tahafut al-Falasifa, right? Using kalam now to purge philosophical ideas from the aqidah of the Muslims. And then the third point, he says that doesn't even apply to, or the third rule, he says that doesn't even apply to kalam per se anyways. Right? Regardless of what science you're in, if your whole goal is to get fame and to destroy your opponents and become a popular preacher, then you shouldn't be doing that anyways. So he says, according to these three rules, there's really nothing wrong with what the Ash'aris and the Maturidis are doing anyways. Now, how does he reconcile this with the quotes of the four Imams that seem to be very clear? What he says basically is that the quotes of the four Imams of fiqh are not referring to the kalam that we recognize as the kalam of the Ash'aris and the Maturidis. Especially considering the fact that at that time, this is before Imam al-Ash'ari and Imam Maturidi were born, he even says that if they knew Imam al-Ash'ari and Imam Maturidi, referring to the four Imams, they would have accepted them as their own sons because of how important they were in purging these un-Islamic ideas from Sunni Islam. So he basically says that the criticisms of the four Imams are pretty much directly focused on the Mu'tazila and the philosophers of his time. And he also makes an interesting argument, which I personally I'm not sure where I fall on this myself. He says that Imam Abu Hanifa himself engaged in a form of kalam. Particularly in his Kitab al-Fiqh al-Akbar and Kitab al-Alim wal-Muta'allim, he argues that what Imam Abu Hanifa does there, particularly in his discussions of Iman, is a form of kalam. I'm not sure if this is a particularly convincing argument from Tashkoperzadeh, because Al-Fiqh al-Akbar certainly does not take the form of a classical kalam book the way that we would expect from what we can call the mature kalam tradition. So perhaps we can call this a pseudo-kalam or a proto-kalam. So what does this tell us about, number one, Ottoman intellectual history, and then secondly, Islamic intellectual history in general? What we see from Tashkoperzadeh is that his approach is very balanced and it's very nuanced. He is not simply taking the quotes from the four imams and then just transposing that onto his time and place hundreds of years later and say, well, this is exactly what we're going to do. And if Tashkoperzadeh is a representative of a quote-unquote regressive movement in Islamic history, then that's what he would have done. He would have just looked towards the past and put those ideas onto a different time and place. But also he does not entirely disregard the past, right? So this dichotomy now of progressive versus regressive does not really apply, because a progressive Tashkoperzadeh would have said, who cares what the four imams say? We are going to be original. Hum rijal wa nahnu rijal. He would have pulled that out of his pocket. He doesn't do that. And at the same time, he doesn't just take the opinions of the past and assume that it should be applied in a literalistic manner. So especially as a semi-official representative of the Ottoman state, and that's why we talked about the whole madrasa system and the ilmiya, because this is now not just Tashkoperzadeh's opinions. As a representative of the Ottoman state, we can see that this is a semi-official position of the Ottoman state itself. We can see that the intellectual scene in the mid-16th century Ottoman Empire is far too complex to be described through these simple dichotomies and these simple black and white explanations of Islamic history. And I would posit that these black and white explanations of Islamic history really don't apply anywhere. They don't apply in the Ottoman Empire. They don't apply earlier with the with the conflicts between Imam Ghazali and the philosophers. It doesn't apply later with the imposition of modernity into the Muslim world and the writings of later Ottoman and Mughal theologians, such as, of course, Izmirli Ismail Haqqi in late Ottoman states, and people like Ahmad Sirhindi and Shah Waliullah in the Indian subcontinent. So the whole idea that I would posit here is that Islamic intellectual history up until today should not be described and should not be understood as a black and white affair. Rather, it is a very rich tapestry that has existed from the time of the Salaf till today, in which scholars are constantly engaging with the scholarship of the past, rather than trying to either impose that scholarship of the past on the present. No, they're not doing that, nor are they disregarding the scholarship of the past and recreating things and reinventing the wheel in the modern day. Jazakumullah khair. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.